BRICS continues to grow. Every few months, basically, there's a new announcement about BRICS expansion. This is an organization that brings together the countries of the global south, formerly colonized countries, so they can collaborate and to develop economically and to create alternatives to the Western-dominated financial system. BRICS was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then in 2010, South Africa joined. And since then, BRICS has continued to grow. In January 2025, they announced the newest member will be Indonesia. This is very important because Indonesia is the fourth most populous country on Earth and has the seventh biggest economy on Earth. I created an updated map showing the membership of BRICS as of January 2025. There are now 10 countries that are full members of BRICS, including the original 5, plus Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. As of 2025, there are also 8 partner countries in BRICS, which means that they're on the path to becoming a full member in the near future. The 8 partners of BRICS are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. There are also 5 countries that were invited to join BRICS but have not officially given a response yet. Those are Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Vietnam, Nigeria, and Turkey or Turquie. I created several charts that show how important BRICS has become in the global economy. This is using data from the IMF World Economic Outlook as of October 2024. The 10 full members of BRICS, now that Indonesia has been added, together represent 38.8% of the entire global economy when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity. And then when you add in the new 8 partner countries, so you have 18 members and partners of BRICS in total, this is often referred to as BRICS Plus. Together, they represent 41.4% of the global economy. I also took the data of the G7 economies and compared them to the BRICS Plus economies, and I made a chart that illustrates how BRICS is now significantly larger than the G7. The G7 is the group of 7 rich countries, that is the West plus Japan. These are the countries that colonize most of the world. That is Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. As of 2024, they only made up 29% of the world economy, compared to 41.4% for BRICS. And this is a huge shift because back in 1992, the G7 economies made up 47% of the global economy. And the current BRICS countries, obviously BRICS didn't exist in the 90s, but back in 1992, the current BRICS countries only made up 22% of the world economy. So this is an absolutely massive shift in the past 3 decades. And the trend is very clear. Over time, BRICS share of the global economy is increasing, whereas the G7 share, the West share of the global economy, is decreasing over time. Now, the addition of Indonesia to BRICS is very important because Indonesia is one of the largest economies in the global south, and it has been growing very quickly. In fact, in 2023, Indonesia overtook the United Kingdom and France. Its economy is now the 7th largest economy in the world. Indonesia's economy represents 2.4% of global GDP, PPP, whereas the UK and France each only represent 2.2% of the global economy. But think about how much the world talks about countries like the UK and France as if they were still powerful countries. But economically, they're not that powerful anymore. Indonesia has a larger economy. And once again, the trend is going in a clear direction. Over time, Indonesia's share of the world economy is growing, and France's and the UK's share of the global economy is shrinking. Now, what's interesting about Indonesia's admission to BRICS is it actually came as a surprise because previously at the BRICS summit that was held in the Russian city of Kazan in October 2024, Indonesia was invited to become a partner of BRICS on the path to becoming a full member. However, in January 2025, the foreign ministry of Brazil announced that Indonesia had become the newest full member of BRICS. By the way, Brazil is currently the chair country of BRICS. So every year, BRICS has an alternating chair. In 2024, the chair was Russia. In 2023, the chair was South Africa. This year, it's Brazil. And Brazil actually announced that Indonesia had been invited to become a full member back at the summit in South Africa in the city of Johannesburg in 2023. However, Indonesia asked for a delay because it had an election coming up. So Indonesia wanted to wait until after the election in order to become a full member of BRICS. Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, took office in October of 2024. And as of the 6th of January, Indonesia is now officially a full member of BRICS. Brazil emphasized how important this is, noting that Indonesia has the largest population and the largest economy in Southeast Asia. And Brazil said that Indonesia will work together with other members of BRICS to support reforms to global governance institutions and will deepen the cooperation of the Global South, which are priorities for Brazil as the president of BRICS this year. So those are the two main goals, according to the current chair of BRICS. It is to reform global governance institutions. That includes institutions like the United Nations and financial institutions in particular, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And also the other main goal of BRICS is to deepen cooperation of the Global South. China's foreign ministry also confirmed that Indonesia is now a full member of BRICS. It congratulated Indonesia, and Beijing said that, quote, BRICS is a main platform for promoting solidarity and cooperation of the Global South and a major force driving the reform of the global governance system. BRICS countries are always committed to multilateralism, fairness and justice, and common development. BRICS' latest edition follows the historic trend of the collective rise of the Global South, end quote. Indonesia's addition to BRICS is also quite symbolic because Indonesia was one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement back in 1961. This was at a time when the Cold War that the United States was waging was heating up, and the Global South countries in the non-aligned movement said that they refused to join in the Cold War. Instead, they wanted to create a new system based on cooperation and economic development, opposing colonialism. Indonesia's leadership role in the Global South was also deeply symbolic because in 1955, Indonesia had hosted the famous Bandung Conference that brought together formerly colonized countries in Bandung, in Indonesia, to get together to discuss how they can cooperate, to increase trade, to lift their peoples out of poverty, and to support the further decolonization struggles. Because at that time, in the 50s, there were still many countries that were colonized by the Western powers. At the time, during the 1955 Bandung Conference and the 1961 creation of the non-aligned movement, Indonesia was led by a leftist anti-imperialist leader named Sukarno. However, in 1965, the United States backed a military coup that overthrew Indonesia's President Sukarno and created a military dictatorship that carried out one of the most horrific massacres of the 20th century. With the support of the CIA, the Indonesian military dictatorship killed between 1 million and 3 million leftists in Indonesia, destroying the Communist Party of Indonesia, which was one of the largest communist parties in the world, and killing many labor organizers and progressive activists. The CIA admitted that this is one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century, and it was supported by the United States. And the people of Indonesia, they still remember this history with horror. For the people of Indonesia, the Cold War was not very cold. It was very hot. It was very bloody. So given that history in Indonesia, and given the long history of the anti-colonialist struggle in Indonesia, it's no surprise that many people in the country are looking toward BRICS, and in particular, they're looking toward China, and they're not looking toward the West. A poll in 2024 found that 73% of Indonesia say that if they were forced to pick a side between China and the United States, 3/4 of people in Indonesia said they would pick China. Only 1/4 of people say they would pick the United States. This poll was conducted looking at countries in ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These include some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and Indonesia has the largest population and the biggest economy in ASEAN. If you look at the polling in 2024, overall, a majority of people in ASEAN prefer China over the US, especially in Malaysia, where 75% of people prefer China. In Laos, 71% of people prefer China. And in Thailand, 52% of people prefer China. And Thailand is also now a partner of BRICS. The population is more divided in Cambodia and Myanmar. And then in Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines, the population leans more toward the United States, especially the Philippines, where the United States has recently created several new military bases. And I should point out that the Philippines was actually previously a U.S. colony from 1898 until 1946. And still today, the political elites in the Philippines are very pro-U.S., including the current president, Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of the longtime U.S.-backed military dictator who had the same name, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the Philippines with an iron fist with U.S. support during the First Cold War. Now, as part of Washington's strategy in the new Cold War that the United States is waging today against China, the U.S. has been trying to recruit new allies in Southeast Asia to join in its very aggressive policies against China. The Philippines has been the main country in the region to join with the U.S. Vietnam has been neutral. Vietnam has very good relations with both China and the U.S. But Indonesia has been leaning away from the U.S. and toward China. In fact, in 2023, there was a political scandal in Indonesia when the United States published a press release claiming that it had an alliance with Indonesia. And the Indonesian government denied this. At this time in 2023, Indonesia's president was Joko Widodo, and Indonesia's defense minister was Prabowo Subianto. Prabowo is now the new president of Indonesia as of October 2024. But back when he was defense minister, he denied this press release that was published by the United States. He said that it was false. So to clarify, the United States published a statement that it claimed was a joint statement with Indonesia. And Indonesia said, no, that was false. Indonesia criticized the U.S. for trying to divide Southeast Asia. And Indonesia's defense minister and now President Prabowo emphasized, he said, quote, "What is important for me to underline is that our relationship with China is very good. We respect each other. We already have a mutual understanding. I conveyed that in the U.S. We are close friends with China. We respect America. And we seek friendship with Russia," end quote. So he made it very clear that Indonesia is not a U.S. ally. Yes, they have good relations with the U.S. They don't want to be an enemy. They don't want to be the target of another U.S.-backed coup and massacre. However, he made it clear that Indonesia is a close friend of China and also seeks friendship with Russia. And now that Indonesia is a full member of BRICS, it's going to deepen its integration with other countries in the global south. And this makes sense for Indonesia because China is by far Indonesia's largest trading partner. As of 2022, 22.6% of Indonesia's exports went to China, and 28.5% of Indonesia's imports came from China. That's by far the largest. No other country comes even close. And it's not just Indonesia. China is the largest trading partner of all of ASEAN. It has been that way for well over a decade. And the share of its total trade that ASEAN does with China is increasing over time, whereas ASEAN's trade with the EU and Japan is decreasing over time. Indonesia also plays a very important role in the global economy because it is by far the biggest producer of nickel on Earth. No country even comes close to producing as much nickel as Indonesia. And by the way, half of the world's top 10 producers of nickel are now in BRICS. Nickel is especially important in the 21st century as countries try to transition away from fossil fuels because of the threat of climate change. And nickel is needed for basically all renewable energy technology, for batteries, solar panels. It's very important. And the Indonesian government has been very clever in how it has used this to propel its economy forward and to develop. In fact, the Indonesian government banned the export of raw minerals because it wanted to capture more of the value added in the process to help to grow its own economy instead of simply exporting unprocessed raw materials, which many countries in the global south have done, losing that potential value. This has angered Western countries and US-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization, and they have criticized Indonesia, claiming that it's violating free trade principles. But Indonesia emphasizes that this is a matter of sovereignty. This is a matter of defending its own economic interests and using its natural resources to benefit its population and not Western corporations. And China has been very helpful in collaborating with Indonesia in this process, helping it to industrialize and add more value. Even the US Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a US think tank that's funded by the US government and is very anti-China, they published an interesting paper titled "How Indonesia Used Chinese Industrial Investments to Turn Nickel into the New Gold." There was another research paper that was published in 2024 by the hawkish Australian think tank, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which is very anti-China and is funded by the Australian government, and specifically the Australian Ministry of Defense. This paper is titled "Indonesia's Nickel Supremacy, China's Backing, and Australia's Decline." Now, even though this paper is very biased, I actually want to read some parts of it because it shows how brilliant Indonesia's industrial policy has been, how it has used state-led economic development in order to lift its people out of poverty and to become one of the fastest-growing large economies in the world. This paper noted that Indonesia's domination of the global nickel market has been carefully planned by the Indonesian government as it looked to boost its downstream industrial policy in critical minerals processing with the backing of Chinese investment. Since 2014, going back to the previous Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, there was strategic planning by Jakarta in order to onshore the added value of nickel supply chains. It started with Indonesia banning nickel exports. This led the European Union to formally complain to the World Trade Organization. Indonesia argued that this is a case of protecting its national economic interests and that global trading rules are unfairly detrimental to developing nations. The Indonesian Minister for Economic Affairs called them a form of economic imperialism. That's an exact quote, economic imperialism, when the International Monetary Fund, which is dominated by the United States, the US is the only country with veto power in the IMF. The IMF demanded that Jakarta remove its export ban, which is why Indonesia called this economic imperialism by the West. In addition to banning raw materials, Indonesia asked for assistance from China, and China not only invested, but it also gave concessional financing. That means below market value. So Chinese state-owned banks and state-owned enterprises were giving very favorable loans to Indonesia and investing in Indonesia to help industrialize. This is an example of what China refers to as win-win cooperation or mutually beneficial development. China benefits because it gets access to nickel, which it needs to make batteries and solar panels. And Indonesia benefits because Chinese state-owned companies are helping to industrialize and training people, Indonesian workers, in how to actually do this, because they previously had no experience in actually processing the nickel. Previously, they had simply exported the nickel, the raw mineral. So China is providing the technical expertise and know-how and the physical capital and investment, and China's also state-owned banks are providing very favorable loans. So it's win-win for both Indonesia and China. This report also noted that China is investing in Indonesia not only to help add value to its process of nickel production, but also to manufacture electric vehicles. So Chinese EV makers like BYD are starting to open up factories in Indonesia, which again is mutually beneficial for both. It helps to provide jobs and develop the local economy in Indonesia. It helps to develop an industrial sector and industrial workers in Indonesia who can go on to create their own companies. And of course, China benefits as well. This paper noted that China financed the supporting infrastructure in Indonesia needed for nickel processing. This was set up in Indonesia through China's Belt and Road Initiative, and there have been massive benefits in Indonesia. Indonesia now adds value to its exports of nickel. Previously, when Indonesia was only exporting raw nickel ore, it exported just around 6 billion in 2013. However, a decade later, as of 2022, Indonesia exported 30 billion. So they quintupled the value of their exports, because if you're just exporting the raw ore, you're not capturing a lot of the value added in the process. But if you process that ore and you actually create processed nickel, you can make 5 times as much money. And now Indonesia is attracting manufacturers to create electric vehicle batteries in Indonesia. And as this think tank funded by the Australian government put it, quote, Indonesia's nickel bet has paid off, end quote. Quote, Indonesia's success has been Australia's loss. And it added that Indonesia's two-pronged strategy of industrial and trade policy was made possible due to its economic partnership with China. So I think this is the perfect example of what BRICS cooperation can look like going forward. Western countries have exploited these countries in the global south for centuries. In fact, Indonesia was colonized by the Netherlands, which is now part of the European Union. And here we are in the 21st century, and the EU is trying to use the World Trade Organization, and the US is trying to use the IMF to prevent Indonesia from using its own resources to benefit its people, to develop its economy. They complain that Indonesia is using protectionist policies and restricting exports of ores, of raw materials, and yet we see in the US and in Europe, their governments are also moving toward protectionism. But they're telling the rest of the world only the West is allowed to use protectionist policies and tariffs and export restrictions. But meanwhile, when the global south tries to do it to benefit its own population, the US and the EU use the World Trade Organization and the IMF to try to punish these countries. This explains why so many people in the global south are looking to BRICS as a possibility for an alternative. It's why they're collaborating to try to create alternative financial institutions, to create alternatives to the US-dominated IMF and the World Bank. That's why BRICS created the New Development Bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank. And BRICS also is developing an alternative to the IMF, which can provide liquidity for countries that are dealing with balance of payments issues. So there are so many exciting things happening in BRICS in the global south. If you want to get more information about the proposal that BRICS has made to transform the international monetary and financial system, in the description below, I will link to a video and a report that I published that summarizes a lengthy report that was published by Russia in 2024 in its capacity as the chair of BRICS that details their plans for transforming the global financial system and creating alternatives to Western domination and the US dollar. Of course, de-dollarization is at the heart of what BRICS is doing, creating alternatives to the dollar system in which the US benefits. It has the exorbitant privilege of printing the global reserve currency, and the US can create more and more debt and export its inflation to the rest of the world because of global demand for dollars. So more and more countries in BRICS have been trading with each other in their local currencies, including Indonesia, and ASEAN countries are using their local currencies for trade, not the dollar, and other BRICS members are using local currencies. There are so many exciting things happening. If you like learning about what's going on in the world and you want to get more information, please subscribe to Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and share this. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please come back soon. I will see you next time.